Well, welcome back. In this installment, we'll talk just like when we looked at the story of the three little pigs and saw how the story had a background exposition about the three little pigs living with their mother. And then there was a narrative hook that got you engaged with the story where the mother sent them out to build homes of their own in the wide world. That exposition and narrative hook was intimately linked to the content of the action as it was rising and the falling action where the pigs end up staying in the house of brick all together and lived in a better future state of peace and well-being. But this time, instead of having three individual homes, they shared that one home with peaceful environment away from the wolf. That structure also can be used to think about your manuscript, where you talk about what is known from the science in the introduction, what is not known, and then what you're going to do to fill that gap in knowledge. Then when you talk about your methods, the methods that you explain are going to be explained in light of that gap. And similarly, as you then use your analytic method, you talk about the primary result that you found from your analysis, and then you begin to discuss the meaning of that primary aim. You're using this five-part structure to tell a story about your work. And so the outline can help you to identify the key components. For example, if you use a theoretical framework in your introduction, and that frames the methodology that you use to close a gap in practice, that also could be a structure that you use to frame your research findings, the results that you have. So if you talk about the theory of reasoned action and the components that drive decision making for individual patients, that might be part of what is known, the theory of reasoned action from the literature, but perhaps what is not known is how the theory of reasoned action can be used to maximize adherence to a drug regimen for adolescent patients with chronic disease. So then when you talk about your results, you probably are going to want to frame those in light of the components of the theory of reasoned action. And then when you have your discussion, you'll talk about how your work perhaps confirmed, disconfirmed, or challenged key components of that theory of reasoned action, so that when you talk about the better future state, you're framing what you found in light of what is known on that theory of reasoned action. And so you have a whole narrative arc for your story about the gap that you identified, what you found in your work to fill the gap, and then how that frames the future for practice or for scholarship. So that overall narrative arc is what you want to convey when you outline your manuscript this week. And even if there are components that you don't yet have, for example, if you don't have results yet, you can still use the outline to create the buckets, the overall ideas that you plan to discuss once you do have the results. And by outlining now, you can think about how you want to present the results once you have them, based on the theoretical and scientific background that you've discussed. So you can use the Anatomy of a DNP Manuscript template this week to help you in writing that outline. This template provides some key buckets of information that you want to include in the standard scholarly manuscript. And certainly there might be variations on a theme depending on the requirements of your specific journal. But this is a generic framework that fits a quantitative driven DNP project that has an introduction, methods, results, and discussion section. So here in this outline, if you include one to two key sentences or a couple of key bullet points under each of these areas, it will allow you to produce a skeleton for your manuscript. And if you already have a lot of your manuscript written, this can be a check back for you to make sure you've covered these critical areas of telling the story of your project. So if you're at the early design stages, you might be starting with this skeleton. If you're far advanced in your project, it might be a way to confirm that you're including the information that's really necessary. Either way, this week and the assignment for the outline, you're going to talk about the introduction, methods, results, and discussion for your manuscript. You'll modify these titles based on your author guidelines for the target journal, if necessary, but you'll want to include information about the practice problem, your literature review on that problem, what the issues are in the specific setting where you're working, and then what is the evidence for the potential solutions to that problem, and what are the theories or frameworks that are guiding your work. So that's a little bit about what goes into your introduction section. So you could put 1 to 2 bullet points about the problem summary, what's known from the current literature, what are the key issues as you've appraised the evidence. So then that sets you up in the introduction to then talk about what is not known. What's the gap in scholarship or practice that's driving your project? How are you going to fill a specific gap in that scholarship or in that practice? And then you'll have a very brief statement about what you will do to close that gap, where you explain the primary aim, perhaps secondary aims of your work, and any sub-objectives under those aims if that's relevant for you. So that would then be the outline of your introduction section. Then you explain your methods. And generally, you start with an overview of your methods. You talk in very broad terms about the practice setting, how the project is designed, and any key instruments. It's a very brief 360-degree view of the methods that you're using to close the gap that you've identified. Then you'll talk specifically about the practice setting. What's the population or the context, the patient population, the unit population, facility, or policy environment that you're addressing. And then you can talk about the sample of people or units that you're going to be extracting from that overall population to study. And that's where you explain the exclusion and the inclusion criteria. What allows someone to end up being in your DNP project? What allows a unit to be in your DNP project? Again, this is bullet point, very focused, very high-level view of these key issues, so that now the practice setting helps the reader understand the design, because your design is going to be modified and mediated by this practice setting, and the two work hand in hand. So you'll talk about what type of design you're using, such as an observational study, a quality improvement study, a randomized clinical trial, a crossover design, a implementation science pragmatic trial, or such. What is it that you're going to be using to answer the question? If you have interventions, you can describe those, and then what procedures are you going to use to gather data to conduct the intervention for your project? In the analysis section, you'll talk about the instruments you use to collect your data. These could be standard instruments like the PHQ-9, the 9 items for a depression screening, or they could be instruments that you create on your own. But you describe those, you link the variables that you're studying to the theoretical framework that you've identified earlier, and then you talk about the descriptive statistics and the analytic statistics you'll use to study the data that you obtain when you do your project. And finally, you typically close the methods section by talking about your ethical reviews that were granted by which institutions, using specific numbers or dates that those approvals were given. So that finishes your methods section. Again, a couple of bullet points per item in the methods gives that 360-degree overview. If you don't have any results yet, it doesn't matter. You can still outline what you intend to summarize about the participant characteristics or the facility characteristics or unit characteristics, and how you'll frame the results from your primary aim. If you have a theoretical framework guiding your analysis, then you'll explain your results in light of that theory. Here's what we found using the theory of reasoned action when it comes to planning. And then finally in the discussion section, you'll say, so what? What does this result mean? You'll think about the meaning of that result for practice, for science, for policy, for practice, for population health and well-being. You talk about why does this matter? And here again, you're going to be linking your discussion all the way back to the background literature and particularly to the theoretical framework or model that you've been using. What are the key points that you need to discuss and explain for the results that you have? How do these results help improve our understanding of the practice setting? How does it advance science? How does it help us clarify or understand the theory? So that's talking about the so what. Then you might talk about the extension of your work, the implications. So based on these findings, here's the implication of what we should do in practice in the future. Here's how we should shape policy based on what I found. Here are opportunities to improve the systems of care for patients and populations based on my work. Then you talk about the future directions. What could be done to bring greater clarity or understanding on this issue? What future studies might be helpful? What changes in practice are warranted? You have an inclusion of the limitations, because every study, every DMP project has limitations. You don't have to be exhaustive here, but you think about what are the gaps in the methodology that I used. And finally, there's usually a one-paragraph conclusion and summary statement that wraps everything together in one succinct package, talking about how your work filled the gap that was identified and what is the meaning of your findings for the future. So if you think about this story like the Three Little Pigs, and you give your readership a clear picture of what is known, what's not known, what you did to close that gap, and then what methods were used, how you designed the project, where it was conducted, how you analyzed your data, and what specific findings you had, that gives you an architecture to guide your DNP project. So in your outline for this week, let's take a look at the assignment. So as you write this outline of the entire manuscript, you're going to put in the key points and messages for your work using the outline from this template and modifying it as you need to. Be certain to include how you intend to frame information, even if you don't yet have it. And be sure to either use bullet points or very brief sentences under each heading in this template, or as customized for your journal. But be sure that this is absolutely no more than 1.5 pages. It needs to be very focused to help you see your manuscript from beginning to end and help your readers to see what you intend to write about. So have fun crafting this picture of your manuscript story this week.